leads the way through the damp 7th basement corridor with steady confidence, while Adelia follows half a step behind, her brows tightening at the ominous cave ahead. The fluorescent glow from contaminated water deepens the chill as a distant roar unsettles her composure. Adelia steps into the cave first, still suspicious, and asks how Roll knew her name. Roll answers with calm certainty, and her guarded expression softens into reluctant acceptance as she nods and continues forward into the darkness. Adelia advances under the sword's teal glow and cuts down the first wave of fluorescent fairies before Roll can react. The small monsters fall in scattered pieces across the stone floor, and she reports their path forward with cool focus while Roll watches in stunned silence. In the boss chamber, Peter Pan's oppressive presence forces Adelia back a step, but Roll remains unaffected and draws the feather sword. Adelia braces herself against the looming threat as Roll prepares to take over the battle, his calm expression unchanged. Roll, calm but intent, gestures for Adelia to move ahead as he saves his strength for a true emergency. Adelia turns toward him with a suspicious, puzzled look, her brows tightening at his sudden familiarity with her name. Adelia faces forward again after accepting his excuse, then steps deeper into the cave with a wary expression. Roll follows a pace behind her, watching her back as the darkness thickens around the entrance. Adelia slows and murmurs that it is dark, her brow furrowing as she scans the shadowed passage ahead. Roll keeps pace behind her, silent and composed, letting her lead while the cave swallows the light around them. Roll continues behind Adelia without hesitation, his expression steady as the dungeon's darkness closes in. Adelia remains ahead, alert and slightly tense, leading them deeper into Hidden Dungeon 2. Adelia advances first through the black cave, her composure sharpening as teal light gathers around her drawn sword. Roll follows a step behind, watching the dim path while the first fluorescent fairies burst into view ahead, their speed forcing her attention forward. A fairy darts in at head height, and on with a single decisive swing, her teal-lit blade cutting through the swarm before Roll can react. The monsters tumble out of the air, and her expression stays calm as the cave floor receives the scattered bodies. Roll looks down at the aftermath in stunned silence, while Adelia lowers her sword and reports that they will proceed. Her calm certainty contrasts with his bewildered pause as the cave's wet floor glints beneath the fallen monsters. Adelia turns her head toward Roll and asks whether her earlier sword work was acceptable, her expectant gaze softening the cave's harsh darkness. Roll hesitates, then prepares a careful answer while the fluorescent puddles continue to cast faint light around their boots. Roll keeps his gaze lowered for a beat, lips pressed in hesitation, then shifts his attention toward Adelia's question without changing his calm posture. Adelia remains a step ahead, waiting with bright, expectant eyes as the cave's damp glow flickers around them. Adelia speaks carefully, asking for feedback on her sword technique while keeping her posture composed and dutiful. Roll listens in silence, his expression unreadable as he weighs how to answer her sincere, hopeful request. Roll keeps his silence a moment longer, then studies Adelia's expectant face as if searching for a believable answer. Adelia holds her breath, waiting beside him in the dim cave, her hopeful expression unchanged. Roll answers at last with a grave tone, and Adelia's eyes widen as she absorbs the strange praise. His calm expression hides his uncertainty, yet his words steady her, and her posture straightens with sincere relief. Adelia lowers her gaze briefly, then nods with a faint smile and accepts the advice as if it were precious instruction. Roll watches her reaction in silence, mildly puzzled by her gratitude, while the cave's damp stillness and green-blue reflections keep the moment intimate and hushed. Roll keeps walking over the uneven cave floor, and his breathing grows shallow as fatigue begins to weigh on his legs. The rising stat window flashes through his mind, and he feels embarrassed by how quickly exhaustion catches him while Adelia continues ahead without slowing. Adelia stops in place and draws a short breath, then wipes the bloodless fluorescent residue from her sword with a controlled motion. Roll lingers behind her, still winded, watching her calm efficiency with a mix of relief and self-conscious frustration. Adelia lifts her head toward the towering stone gate and plants both hands against its surface, her expression tightening with resolve. Roll stands just behind her, watching the sealed entrance as dust trembles loose from the ceiling. Adelia drives the gate inward with both hands, leaning her weight into the stone until the seam opens with a grinding roar. Roll remains behind her, steady and alert, as the chamber beyond begins to show through the widening gap. Inside the revealed chamber, Peter Pan crouches in the center with 6 great swords angled around its body, wings twitching beneath ragged green scraps. Adelia freezes at the threshold, while Roll stands a little behind her, both staring into the oppressive stillness. Peter Pan remains crouched and motionless in the chamber's center as Adelia and Roll hold their positions at the entrance, the silence stretching between them. The boss's wings quiver once, and the great swords stay braced around its body, while both adventurers face the threat ahead. Adelia recoils a half step, her shoulders tightening as Peter Pan's oppressive aura presses over her. Roll remains steady beside her, her, watching the boss with calm focus while preparing to speak. The chamber's silence sharpens the distance between them and the crouched monster. Roll turned his head slightly toward Adelia and spoke with measured confidence, framing the battle as the final stage of her training. Adelia held still for a beat, her expression tense but attentive, while Peter Pan remained an unmoving threat in the background. The moment carried a cold, deliberate calm before the clash. Adelia steadied herself and lifted her chin, letting fear harden into stubborn resolve as she faced Peter Pan again. Roll stayed beside her, still unshaken, while the boss's hulking silhouette waited ahead in the gloom. The chamber felt poised on the edge of violence. Adelia drew her sword without hesitation and advanced from the left foreground toward Peter Pan at center distance, her teal-eyed face tense but determined. Peter Pan remained ahead in the middle of the chamber, looming with predatory stillness as she closed the gap, ready to test her resolve. Peter Pan vanished into Adelia's reach and reappeared in front of her in a single burst of speed, driving a heavy sword strike that she barely met with a shocked parry. The impact jolted her arm, and her stance broke as she struggled to absorb the force. Adelia retreated clumsily across the slick chamber floor as Peter Pan pressed forward with 6 blades in a storm of overlapping angles. She kept defending with strained precision, but the relentless pressure left her visibly shaken and increasingly covered in scratches. Peter Pan surged again, twisting his massive body midair as Adelia faltered under the speed and weight of his assault. She remained on the defensive, breathing hard and bracing herself against the final pressure of the exchange, while his overwhelming momentum left her visibly outmatched. Adelia remained locked in a desperate defense as Peter Pan's 6 blades crowded her space, her resolve strained but unbroken. She kept her footing on the slick floor, buying a heartbeat for the man behind her to act. Roll judged the fight in a single instant and drew the feather sword, deciding that Adelia had already done enough. As the skill took hold, his calm sharpened into absolute certainty, and he stepped into the battle to take control. Roll's brief surge of omnipotence ended in a single clash, and Peter Pan's pressure met a force it could not withstand. Adelia, still blocking at close range, realized with shock that the monster before her had already been surpassed. The battle ended as Roll stood over the fallen boss, and Adelia stared in disbelief at the clean result. He remained composed, already turning his attention away from the corpse and back to the trial's reward. Adelia clenched her jaw and forced her feet to hold position as Peter Pan's blade pressed her back toward the glowing floor. She ignored the sting at her shoulder, kept both hands on her sword, and tried to meet the next swing with a trembling guard, her fear sharpening into stubborn resolve. Adelia's eyes widen as the great sword rushes into view, and she shuts them at the last instant, bracing for impact. A violent burst of wind sweeps through the chamber, and when the roar vanishes, she freezes in place and listens for the next movement with her breath held. Roll stepped into the cleared space beside the fallen boss, his calm gaze fixed on the aftermath while Adelia stared in stunned silence. He lowered his sword and addressed her in an even voice, leaving the bisected corpse behind him as the chamber settled into uneasy quiet. Adelia slowly opened her eyes and drew a sharp breath, her shock turning into disbelief as the silence settled around her. Ahead, Peter Pan's massive body lay motionless on the cave floor, and she stared toward the place where the final blow had landed. Roll stood 5 paces ahead with a serene expression, his gaze lowered to the floor as if confirming the result. He calmly wiped blood from the feather sword and spoke without urgency, while Adelia remained frozen behind him, struggling to understand what she was seeing. Adelia's expression tightened into astonishment as Roll's words sank in, and her gaze shifted from his calm face to the ruined boss at his feet. The realization struck her all at once. He had ended the battle before she could even comprehend it. Roll finished wiping the sword and delivered his question in the same even tone, unbothered by the aftermath. Behind him, Adelia remained speechless, staring at the bisected corpse as the dungeon's notification confirmed the boss's defeat. Roll stood alone beside the bisected corpse, his calm gaze lowered to the clean cut at his feet. He silently weighed the absurdity of soul of the swordmaster, feeling more analytical than triumphant as he confirmed that his body had suffered no recoil at all. After a brief pause, Roll lifted his eyes from the corpse and considered the possibility that the skill had raised his physical stats during activation. His expression stayed composed, but the thought left him quietly impressed by the strange, cheat-like nature of the power. Roll turned his head toward Adelia, then lowered his gaze back to Peter Pan's bisected body, his expression still measured despite the grisly task ahead. Adelia remained frozen a few steps away, staring at him in stunned silence as he reached into the corpse to retrieve the hidden crystal. Roll drew the ominous crystal free and held it up before his chest, the feather sword in his other hand cutting away the tangled veins and slime clinging to it. Adelia's stunned stare sharpened into alarm as she finally focused on the object in his palm and asked what it was. Roll answered Adelia without hesitation, naming the crystal an ordeal prepared by the great elders. Adelia stayed fixed in place, absorbing the explanation with a shaken, disbelieving look while the crystal glinted ominously in Roll's steady hand. Roll finished his explanation and tightened his fist around the crystal without hesitation. The fragment burst into dust in his palm, and a dark red aura climbed over his body as his vision dimmed under the ordeal's chilling screams. Roll entered the ordeal and found himself in a black, silent realm where the last echoes of the crystal's power faded. He stood unmoved as the oppressive darkness settled around him, his expression calm despite the unsettling voices that had just vanished. Roll remained motionless as the silence deepened, confirming that the ordeal had fully accepted him. He kept his gaze steady in the empty darkness, composed and analytical, ready to continue through the trial's unseen demands. Roll stood alone in the black silence, his calm gaze fixed ahead as the ordeal's accusation faded into memory. He remained composed, feeling the weight of the factory's tragedy settle into understanding rather than fear. A polluted-on into view before Roll, its fluorescent body and tiny wings trembling with resentment. Roll did not retreat. He watched the spirit's approach with steady focus, recognizing the sorrow behind its fury. The memory of the factory sharpened around Roll as corrupted Tinkerbell's and Peter Pan's monstrous revenge filled the chamber in his mind. He stood unmoved at the center of the recollection, understanding that the tragedy had turned victims into relentless monsters. Roll stood alone in the black void as resentful voices pressed in from every direction, his expression tightening with wary focus. Scarlet ghosts gathered ahead of him in a swelling wall, and he braced himself as the crimson mass began to surge closer. The ghosts thickened into a roaring crimson tide, and Roll held his ground as the pressure of their hatred closed in. He kept his shoulders squared and his gaze forward, visibly uneasy yet controlled, while the spectral swarm crowded the space around him. Roll narrowed his eyes as the crimson mountain of spirits rushed within striking distance, but he remained unervingly calm. The dark void around him was now almost entirely dyed red, and he prepared to endure the ordeal without retreat. Roll recalled that the spirit world normally demanded perfect evasion, then noticed the passive max spirit effect and understood that the ghost's mental assaults could not touch him. A vengeful spirit brushed past his shoulder, yet he remained motionless, calm relief replacing his earlier caution. As another ghost surged through his space, Roll confirmed that he felt nothing at all, and his guarded expression eased into quiet certainty. The realization settled that the ordeal's attacks were only harmless mental pressure to him, turning the terrifying swarm into a meaningless spectacle. Roll recognized that his max spirit stat nullified the vengeful spirits outright, and a faint, confident resolve replaced the last trace of tension. With the swarm rendered powerless, he stood as an invincible presence in the spirit world, ready to let the ordeal collapse around him. Roll, still centered in the black void, calmly judges the crimson storm as a useless illusion and speaks with quiet certainty. The raging spirits hesitate, their pressure breaking against his unshaken composure. Roll finishes his dismissal, and the crimson vortex collapses at once as the vengeful spirits vanish from every side. The sudden silence settles over him, leaving only his steady breathing and a faint sense of triumph. Roll lifts his gaze into the restored silence as the ordeal acknowledges him, and his expression remains composed rather than surprised. He accepts the recognition as the natural result of his plan, already focused on the reward that follows. The chamber's darkness thinned as the voice granted the remnant, and Roll looked up with quiet satisfaction. At his feet, Peter Pan's corpse began to break apart into drifting dust while Adelia stared from a short distance away, stunned by the impossible result. The reward window spread across Roll's vision as the ordeal's end settled over the chamber. He kept his posture steady and smiled brightly, while Adelia remained frozen beside him, her disbelief deepening as she watched him receive the authority skill. Adelia finally understands the scale of Roll's achievement and stands speechless, her composure shaken by awe. Roll remains calm beside her, already finished with the trial, while the chamber's starlit silence makes his victory feel even more unreal. Adelia stands a step away with widened teal eyes, her shoulders rigid and her sword lowered at her right side as she stares at Roll in disbelief. Roll remains motionless beside her, serene after the ordeal's collapse, and the chamber's tension lingers in her stunned silence. Roll lifted his gaze from the cave's ceiling and spoke with quiet certainty, his calm expression unchanged. Adelia, still frozen beside him, watched his face as if trying to understand how he could stand so peacefully after enduring such crushing force. Adelia's breath catches as Roll's words settle over the chamber, and her shock softens into wary admiration. Roll remains composed at her side, his posture steady and untroubled, while the oppressive pressure of the ordeal fades into a tense stillness around them. Roll stepped out first into the pitch-black night and cool breeze, then spoke over his shoulder with quiet finality that his business was finished. Adelia stared at his back for a beat, still stunned by what she had witnessed, before hurrying after him with a shaken but obedient expression. Adelia quickens her pace and closes the distance, then answers in a flustered voice voice when Roll stops and turns back to question her delay. Her bewilderment gives way to urgency as she hurries to keep up, eyes fixed on him with lingering disbelief and a trace of awe. Roll resumed walking beside Adelia as they left the factory behind, and the night air opened around them. Adelia fell into step at his side, still unsettled but now focused on following him, while the burning factory and drifting smoke faded into the distance. Roll studies Adelia's troubled face in the open night air, then calmly suggests a memorial service for the victims. Adelia lifts her head in surprise, her hesitation softening into concern as she considers the request and the burden it might place on her. Adelia answers with careful sincerity, admitting that the ritual may take time before agreeing to try. Roll remains composed beside her, giving a brief reassurance that their schedule allows it, and Adelia's expression eases from uncertainty into dutiful resolve. Roll accepts Adelia's answer without pressure, and the two stand together in the quiet night as the memorial service becomes their next task. Adelia steadies herself, ready to begin, while Roll watches the factory with a measured calm that matches the softened air around them. Adelia bowed deeply toward Roll, her gratitude soft but earnest, then straightened with a composed breath. She turned toward the factory and began the memorial service at once, determined to soothe the dead before her lingering sorrow could deepen. Teal sacred flames surged from Adelia's body and spread across the factory exterior, bathing the night in a holy glow. She closed her eyes, lips moving in a quiet prayer, while Roll remained beside her, silently observing the ritual's steady, cleansing advance. As the flames brightened, Adelia kept praying with unwavering focus, her expression peaceful and relieved. Roll stood nearby in quiet approval, letting the memorial continue while the burning factory and rising smoke carried the victims' farewell into the night. Adelia finished the final words of her memorial prayer with quiet relief, her shoulders easing as she kept her eyes closed. Roll stood beside her, watching the burning factory and the rising smoke with a calm, satisfied expression while the night air carried the ritual's warmth. Roll lifted his gaze toward the sky as ash-colored children formed from the smoke and smiled down at him. Adelia opened her eyes and looked upward too, her expression softening with wonder as the teal flames continued to purify the factory behind them. Adelia lowered her hands and breathed out in visible relief as the last of the resentment faded from the factory grounds. Roll turned slightly toward her, his calm expression unchanged, while the teal flames dimmed and the purified night settled around them. Roll studies the purified night sky in silence, then lets his thoughts settle on the impossible change before him. He feels a quiet sorrow for the victims, but the sight of Adelia's completed memorial service gives him a rare, cautious hope that this altered world line can still be steered. Adelia lowers her gaze after the ritual, then steadies herself beside Roll as the last embers of sacred flame thin out around the factory. She feels exhausted yet fulfilled, and his measured calm makes her believe the dead have finally been comforted. Roll studies the burning factory with a faint, knowing smile as the altered future settles in his mind. The impossible survival of people who should have died confirms that this timeline has already diverged, and his calm turns sharper with cautious satisfaction. Roll lowers his gaze to the notification window and accepts the Lord of Kronos' gratitude with quiet composure. The enhanced reward confirms that the anomaly has become an advantage, and his faint smile deepens into determined resolve as he prepares to move forward. Roll reads the reward window with a faint, steady smile as the liberated authority skill settles into his hands. Beside him, Adelia keeps pace in silence, her posture composed while the burning factory glows behind them and the night air carries the last traces of smoke. Roll's expression hardens into quiet resolve as he watches the souls drift freely above the factory. He decides to change the world with his own hands, then turns slightly toward Adelia and calls her name, preparing to leave Dark City Dungard behind. Roll walks onward beside Adelia and tells her that their next destination is the free city of Verdas. Adelia turns her head toward him with quiet readiness, accepting the new route without hesitation as they continue away from the factory and into the open night. Roll keeps his pace steady beside Adelia and asks whether she still intends to continue the long journey. When she answers without hesitation, he feels reassured, yet his thoughts drift to the undead future he narrowly escaped and the necromancer's next move. Adelia nods at once and states that she can endure anything if it leads to enlightenment. Roll accepts her answer with quiet satisfaction, but his mind remains uneasy as he considers whether the necromancer will create another undead from the corpse pit.